On the heels of the National Day of Remembrance and Action on Violence Against Women, advocates want to continue the conversation in hopes of ending the issue in Canada. Today is also day 13 of the 16 Days of Activism Against Gender Based Violence, an annual international campaign which encourages people to help prevent and end all forms of gender based violence. The campaign is set to end on December 10th, Human Rights Day. This month, Women and Gender Equality Canada launched its own national campaign theme, It's Not Just, which highlights both the issue of gender based violence and how society can dismiss and minimize behavior or beliefs associated with it. Well, joining us now to tell us more about this and how Canadians can help end gender based violence is Dr. Erin Whitmore, Executive Director at the Ending Violence Association of Canada. Dr. Whitmore, welcome to Forum Daily.
Thank you for having me.
So, what is the latest data we have on the current state of gender based violence in Canada?
We know that gender based violence continues to be a significant public health and human rights crisis in Canada. Um, for example, we know 1 in 3 women worldwide have experienced physical and sexual violence, and those numbers hold true in Canada. We certainly saw during the pandemic that rates of gender-based violence increased, and also the severity of that violence increased. And we know that there is always an increasing demand for access to services to support those who have experienced violence. I think, though, that the numbers only give us part of the picture, and that we really want to also recognize the significant impacts that gender-based violence holds for those who do experience these types of violence, these forms of violence.
On that note, can you tell us a little bit more about these significant impacts due to gender based violence?
Sure. Well, gender-based violence can take many different forms. Often we hear about domestic violence or intimate partner violence, about sexual assault, but we also want to be aware of emotional or psychological abuse, financial abuse, technology facilitated abuse. And I think it's important to remember that the impacts of that violence don't necessarily end when the violence itself stops, that often survivors of violence face many challenges in accessing services. There can be challenges in terms of mental health, in terms of their ability to continue to go to school or go to work. Impacts in terms of their relationships, and violence continues to really limit and interrupt, the hopes and dreams that women and others who experience violence hold for themselves.
And it's so important to highlight, as you said, that gender-based violence comes in so many forms, not necessarily very obvious forms. Now, in terms
Mhm.
of Canada's national theme, it's not just. Now, that's actually shedding light on how society can sometimes dismiss or minimize such gender-based violence, which can sometimes be in subtle ways. So, can you tell us a little bit more about how this happens?
Yeah, that's so true. And I think that, one of the challenges, of course, is that gender-based violence often can be seen as something that happens between two individuals and is a private matter that, doesn't need to be discussed more broadly. But of course, we know that we have to have a conversation and talk about this violence if we want to make a difference. I think that also, it can be really challenging to talk about these experiences if you yourself are experiencing violence. Often it can be difficult to know who to talk to. It may be difficult to find somewhere to turn to that you feel is a safe place. Often, someone who is using violence also tries to isolate someone, to silence them, and to make it really difficult to make that violence visible. So all of those can contribute to us not fully recognizing the extent of this problem. That being said, there is a lot of evidence that shows the extent of the problem of gender-based violence, and we really need to stop pretending that this isn't as big an issue as it is, and that it really requires action on the part of all Canadians if we really want to make a difference.
Some very important points to consider, especially leading up to Human Rights Day. As we know, women's rights are human rights. Dr. Whitmore, thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.